turns. Yet no matter how often he tells the truth, he is not a truthful agent. Truth in his hands is a convenience. He has no commitment to what, in the analytic tradition, we mean when we say that truth is the goal of inquiry, or that truth is a goal of inquiry. The deception is, in this particular case, so obvious that we may even wonder whether the truth really is told. A challenge to the idea that Edmund does tell the truth may be mounted through the drawing of a distinction, familiar distinction, between what is said and what is meant, between sentence meaning and speaker's meaning. What Edmund says, or at least suggests, is that someone aims to perpetrate a malicious fraud through the letter. But what he really means is that someone else intends to do so. And so the question of whether or not he is actually telling the truth may require an open or mixed answer. In one respect he does, in another respect he does not. There are many such shades of grey and kinds of ambiguity in Shakespeare. Family films are a little bit more straightforward. So I'm covering the spectrum from Shakespeare through to, as it were, Disney, or at least a film that began with Disney and then moved on. But even here we find that the telling of the truth may be implicated in a broader attempted deception. In the popular Peter Pan film Hook, starring Robin Williams as a grown-up Pan, we do not regard Hook as truthful when he tells Pan's children that their parents send them away at great expense, not to give them opportunities, but to get some peace. "It's not true," cry the children. "Oh, I wouldn't lie about something like that. The truth is much more fun." Hook's truth-telling is, like Edmund's, a local part of his overall plan. He wants to alienate parent and child. Part of his revenge against Pan. But his malevolence also emerges through his truth-telling, and not in spite of it. And here the word spite is also itself suitable. In the telling of truth is that which we owe to one another. Spite, malevolence, and the intent to deceive through the telling of truth have no proper place. There are, as anticipated, many strands of thought here, multiple comparisons in different scenarios, family tensions and simian departures. To clarify matters and pull some of these threads together, it may be helpful to think of truthfulness not simply as complex, which might simply imply that there is a norm which requires a good many rules to describe it. Instead, it may help to think about the concept of truthfulness in ways which need not concern individual utterances or norms for utterance, but without some of the ambiguities involved in the terminology of being in the truth. We may then think of truthfulness as the name of a virtue. Certainly Aristotle thought of it this way and contrasted it with pretentiousness and false modesty. I'm not sure about his particular contrasts. He always thinks you have to kind of regard virtues as a corrective, and then he kind of struggles to make sense of precisely what any particular given virtue is a corrective to. However, Aristotle's discussion of truthfulness as a virtue receives less attention than his treatment of other virtue concepts, such as courage and practical wisdom. Yet we may suspect, as Aristotle did, that these virtues are in some way connected. So, for example, the agent who fights courageously but for a false cause may exemplify courage, but the lack of truthfulness at the heart of their commitment means that in such a case, the character trait of courage does not function as a virtue. It's a very old point from Philip Foot. Yeah. Be that as it may, the virtue of truthfulness that Edmund and Hook conspicuously lack is of a sort that links truth-telling to familiar constraints concerning manner, time, place, and intention or motive. To be truthful in this complex or thick sense involves more than a standing disposition to utter truths or to keep silent when harm might ensue. It involves a disposition to tell the truth in the right way, at the right time, and in line with various other standard Aristotelian qualifiers. And what the right way and the right time may happen to be will depend upon all manner of variables, some of which may be linked to local cultural norms and the expectations to which they give rise. In the context of research, these considerations continue to apply. So much of what we do, so much of what we write is, after all, not written for the ages. It is written for a particular audience, with particular presuppositions and concerns at a particular point in time. Sometimes to remain silent will be to fail. Sometimes to speak out or to do so in a particular way may be untimely. And this particularity of context needs to be taken into account when we encounter and make sense of the work of others. Here, just as a small footnote, I'll give a couple of examples. I work in animal ethics, and it's sort of familiar to run through the history of animal ethics, and you say, well, it takes a while before people start to think that animals deserve consideration for their own sake. Before that, we have people like Immanuel Kant, and Kant says, well, we should look after animals and not do certain things to them because this is a matter of indirect concern to humans. So really, in caring for the animals, we're concerned with the humans. And to me, this seems to be an injustice to what Kant is trying to get at. It's one thing to point out certain inadequacies in the way that he carries his argument, certain limitations of the conceptual apparatus which is available at the time in which he tries to develop and build. And another to miss the fact that Kant is striving above all to say that previous philosophers who felt that you could do whatever you like with animals are fundamentally mistaken. That there are constraints, that there are things which must not be done. Again, it's time and place and context. What is he trying to do? Another example here, for those of a more religious bent, would be Anselm's proof of the existence of God. You look at Anselm's text, and Anselm's proof occupies a page and a bit. What's he doing there? Is he really concerned about the possibility that God, is he thinking that his audience might be unconvinced? Yeah? Or is he trying to do something else? Is he trying to use a certain kind of argument structure in order to make sense of what it is that he believes in when he talks about belief in God? The fact that simply stripping out and abstracting the argument from the overall context is convenient for, say, a course in philosophy of religion doesn't mean to say that we're doing justice to and really capturing what Anselm was engaged in. Okay, I'm on the final section now. So how are we for time? Good. Okay. Of course, failures of truthfulness in research, particularly when associated with convenience and partisan commitment, often take a simpler form than uncharitable misreading. But here I want to suggest two things. Firstly, that the simpler failures of truthfulness associated with partisanship tend to involve something other than deliberate deception or failures of candor. And secondly, that the determination to resist such failures can itself introduce dangers, and that's where we came in. In the context of research in the humanities, the messages that we hand over are rarely contrived in the way that Edmund's letter is contrived, as a sheer fabrication. But in between the telling of the truth and fabrication, we have a substantial area of grey, a zone of indifference to the truth that may be far more common than any of us would like to admit. There are cases where the criteria for claims being true or probably true, or at least broadly reliable, are simply those of convenience, that they are expedient or align nicely with what will be of most use in some manner of partisan discussion. The ultimate partisan institution, of course, is the political party, and we know how indifferent they can be with regard to matters of truth. Truth in the hands of political figures is not so much buried as misplaced, lost in the filing system. Again, it ceases to become the goal of inquiry. And here I'll hand wave at the enormous difficulties of cashing out that notion of truth as a goal of inquiry. It's really, really, really difficult to formalise. There is a discourse which captures this kind of idea of an indifference towards truth, the kind that a certain sort of politics seems to encourage. Heidegger calls it idle talk, and Harry Frankfurt has described it, or at least a close relation of this problem, in less flattering terms. The interest or convenience of what is said trumps any concern for actual veracity. Here we may think of gossip, but newspapers are sometimes like this too. The truth is not always allowed to get in the way of a good story. And if the story just so happens to be true, then all the better. But truth alone is unlikely to boost circulation. What matters above all is that a story should be gripping or otherwise interesting, or that it confirms and entrenches rather than challenges beliefs. Better still, if the telling of the story helps to establish standards which may then proliferate across many other fields, allowing other and similarly truth-indifferent but popular stories to be generated. These are admittedly soft targets: gossip, newspapers, political parties. Facebook may be added to the list. Of course, no. I don't know if the gods of Facebook will come down on me for this. They've probably never heard of me. All hail the gods of Facebook. Yeah. However, the problem is far more extensive and reaches into many of our more intractable moral debates about abortion, same-sex marriage, and animal experimentation. Here we may think about how often abortion debates have focused upon procedures which are not only radically uncharacteristic, but may not even qualify as abortion, such as partial birth procedures. Or we may think about threats to the standing of marriage which seem more imagined than supported by anything resembling empirical evidence. Closer to home, in terms of my own research, I think about the strangely unsupported claims made by both sides in the debate over the usefulness and defensibility of animal experimentation. And here I have in mind physically intrusive procedures rather than behavioural experiments of the sort related in Fowler's novel. There is very little in the way of sustained and detailed research that tracks the causal impact of animal experimentation, that tracks the feed-through into positive benefits or their absence. Yet both sides, my side and the other side, have no shortage of those who claim confidently that it is for the most part indispensable and informative, or else that it is comprehensively replaceable and unreliable. When actual research on actual impact is published, as it has begun to be published over the last 10 years, neither side show any great interest. I'm referring here, and if anybody wants to look at some of this stuff, there's been a rolling debate in the British Medical Journal that started in 2004 with a paper by Pandora Pound et al. Pandora started to look at what's actually going on, what's the real feed-through, but Pandora didn't please anyone, So it's she allows that there is a feed-through, but the feed-through is much smaller than most experimenters would like to believe. What makes matters even more peculiar is that defenders of such research are often dismissive of the cognitive competencies of animals because claims about the latter depend upon anecdotal evidence, while the evidence for the utility of experimentation itself is largely anecdotal. By contrast, animal rights activists, who generally take a much more receptive attitude towards anecdotal evidence about animal behaviour, on this one occasion seem quite prepared to dismiss anecdotal evidence of efficacy and guidance in research in spite of the volume of such anecdotal evidence and its consistency. Here I make some claims that will not endear me to either side, claims that I have made repeatedly in various texts and settings, but which I still have serious reservations about making because of my own partisan commitment. When I allow that some animal research might be useful, but still incidentally not permissible, so I'm saying you sacrifice some of this useful stuff, and that my side has a lax attitude towards the evidence for impact, is this an untimely truth about my movement, which I take to be on the right side? An untimely truth because we are still in the middle of the problem? Am I, as many people suggested about Hannah Arendt, too attached to scholarly indifference to the untimeliness of certain truths and lacking in sufficient care or even love for the victims of a great many wrongs? Wrongs which, incidentally, I take to be horrific, but very different from the wrongs involved in the Holocaust. In my defence, all I have to offer is a sympathy with the idea that in certain moral and political conflicts and arguments and debates, the means and ends are often closely related. Put bluntly, the truth will only ever be known and accepted if it is spoken, and spoken in the right way at the right time, and not pushed out of, not pushed aside out of partisan convenience. And it strikes me that the debate over animal experimentation in particular has become so mired in falsehoods deployed from all sides that no progress is likely until the entire terms of the debate are reshaped. To some extent, this will have to be a cooperative venture, something that cannot be secured by my side alone. So where then is truthfulness in research to be found? In the mere renunciation of or safeguarding against truth-indifferent partisanship? Again, matters do not seem so cooperative. When it comes to holding the dangers of partisan alignment in check, we may be subject to a road to Larissa problem. In fleeing from the danger that partisanship poses to truthfulness in research, we may rush towards a different set of failures. We may lapse into a sideways shift into forms of discourse which soften terrible harms beyond recognition, or we may lapse into self-censorship of a sort that the segmentation and narrow focus of academic writing makes all too available. The dangers of a sideways shift in the context of animal harms is one of the reasons why I'm so reluctant to speak only or primarily of animal rights, a concept which I think singularly fails to capture any sense of the moral horror of the incomprehensible scale of animal harms. But the lure of pragmatism and a desire to circumvent the dangers of my own partisanship also draws me towards various sorts of self-censorship. While I refrain from deliberate falsehood and try not to speak out of malice or with bad intentions or in any attempt to deceive, I wonder if I'm ever saying what truly needs to be said, especially so given that what needs to be said at any given time and in any given place is often just as elusive as truthfulness itself. Thank you.
We have time for some questions. Should I be bringing the mic to Director? Should I be bringing the mic to? No? Okay. Do you want to field your own questions?
Sorry?
Do you want to field your own questions?
Yeah, sure, yeah. Unless I don't know the answer. Yeah. Sorry.
Well, I have a question. I'll just speak louder, so I don't know.
Yeah, Kelly.
So Tony, you suggest that there are circumstances in which certain kinds of research probably should not be pursued because we don't feel that it's likely to be used responsibly. And
Yeah.
of course, you can give uncontroversial examples of that. So Heisenberg coordinating with Hitler is
Yeah.
an example of that.
Yeah.
Philosophers might argue about that in some really hypothetical
Yeah.
sense, but most people won't. The difficulty is always in the details. It's like, where exactly do you draw the line? Because although it's clearly true that there are situations where we shouldn't do certain kinds of research, it's also clearly true on the other side that science has enormous benefit for humankind, and that some of the values of science have to do with unfettered investigation and openness of results. Right?
Mm.
And those are endangered to the extent that you censor the way scientists want to proceed.
Mm.
So where exactly is the dividing line, and how do you draw it? And in particular, how do you avoid short-term, sincerely motivated concerns from swapping out what might be longer-term benefits?
Right, yeah. I guess So you have a scientific community which is bound together by, to some extent, certain shared values and a sense of what matters, a sense of what's important. One of the things I'd want to say in relation to that is that, yeah, that's good. We want the commitment to knowledge, yeah, the determination to resist certain kinds of political intrusions into the practice of science. But I'm also going to say that science doesn't exist in a vacuum. It exists in a practical political world, and that there are certain constraints to which science rightly is subjected in a democratic society, and that the history of science doesn't fill us with any great confidence about its ability to police itself in ways which will be morally acceptable. Most of the people who defend animal experimentation today do so premised upon the claim that animal experimentation today is radically different from forms of animal experimentation in the past, forms of experimentation which in many cases were not legitimate. Yeah. So I guess I'm going to say several things, that my priorities are democratic and ethical rather than scientific, yet I appreciate the importance of the practice of science. I don't commit to some kind of scientistic standpoint in which the values of science override all other considerations. So then what we have is what all of us have to live with, and that is a plurality of values and no clear algorithm or decision procedure that will automatically allow us to say that one value trumps another on a particular occasion. What you then are left with is scientists having to exercise practical wisdom, and those who are in a position to exercise or impose certain kinds of constraints upon science also having to exercise practical wisdom, but within the context of democratic debate. So I'm speaking as an outsider, yeah. But I'm happy to do that. Yeah.
My question also has to do with the idea of withholding research. When you mentioned, irresponsible people or people, or I guess threatening people of acquiring research like the Manhattan Project,
Yeah.
which has an obvious physical threat if done improperly. Are there any kind of research that might need to be, in some circumstances, withheld because irresponsible people might use them in a cultural or social context in a harmful way?
Yes, I think so. Suppose you conduct a piece of research about the behaviour of Jewish community leaders in 16th century Westphalia or whatever it is. Most of the time that's going to be fine. Most of the time you're going to publish that. But if you're in 1933 in Berlin and you choose that particular moment, in that particular context to disseminate the critique of their behaviour, then I think you're probably behaving in an ethically irresponsible manner. Similarly, if you have if there's some kind of referendum or public decision making process which is in full swing, and you know the way in which the media uptake on your paper is going to run, and it's going to get skewed and misused in that particular debate, then the smart thing to do is to wait until the morning after the vote, and then you go ahead. So you exercise some kind of social responsibility. And this is the point about the sense that truths can sometimes be untimely. It's not an infinite or indefinite deferral of truth-telling. It's a temporary process. The same way that suppose I find out something, I get the medical results of the bridegroom, yeah, on the day of his wedding. Does anyone have any further reason or something of that sort? And I race up to the front and I deliver. There you go. There's your results, mate. This is not going to have the happy ending that you thought was going to be the case. Yeah, there's a time and a place. The truth has to be told, but the way that you tell it, context, the sensitivity to possible misuses and misappropriation and misrepresentations, that all has to be part of a plausible ethical package.
Could you say a bit more about something that was part of your response to the last question? The truth has to be told? Yeah. Is it as if a wrong will be committed if some truth were known by someone and it were never shared with other people?
Yeah. Well, here's one of these occasions in which speaker's meaning and sentence meaning diverge a little bit. I'm not saying, damn it all, the truth about who was in the telephone directory for Lower Manhattan in 1954 has to be made known to the population at large. No, most truths, this is the funny thing about truth, and about the idea that truth is so important. Most truths are unimportant. Most truths concern things that are completely indifferent to human affairs. So when I say something about the truth, ultimately has to be told. What I'm saying and trying to capture, although I know the ins and outs and how difficult this is that the truths which are relevant to being human, the truths that are relevant to a good life, the truths that are relevant to individuals being in a position to exercise choice on their own behalf, and all of those kinds of things, that I think without a commitment, a bottom line commitment to those truths being told when the moment is right, then one's research inquiries, political strategies, and moral commitment, I think, is in some way fundamentally eroded. And do I have a bigger story about that? Maybe that's an intuition. Maybe it's an intuition we share. Maybe we don't. Yeah.
Suppose a man is with his wife. She's here dead.
Yeah.
There's a truth he knows. He's been having an affair.
Yeah.
Should that truth be told?
In that moment, obviously, there's a strong case for saying no. You don't want to corrupt and pollute someone's final moments. But at some point prior to that moment, the truth should have been told. So there is a sense here that the windows of opportunity for truth-telling may not always be indefinitely open. Yeah? So sometimes you have to make that linkage between courage and truthfulness, and recognize that here is the time. I know it's not going to feel good, but now is the time that I must tell the truth, because in the future it may become too damaging. It may become I may lose the moment. So I think that's the kind of qualification that my story about the need for the truth requires.
So that would be a truth that should never be told. The window is closed.
Yeah. So I
Closed, and he wants to do it now because
yeah.
once she's gone, to whom should he report this truth?
To whom should you report this truth?
Call up the children?
Yeah.
And tell them, like,
Come.
I don't.
Well, if he has children, I think at some point in time the children should know. I think that unless there is some overriding reason against it. So I guess when one puts forward claims about the truth should be told, there's always when you temporalize lots of propositions, you always have to add lots of kinds of riders. But in principle, I'm not hostile to the suggestion that a truth which ought to have been told at some point in time may permanently lose its window of opportunity. That the time may simply be gone, and then the person has to carry that burden. That sounds like a tragic predicament, but I'm not hostile to the possibility of those occurring. Yeah.
Thank you.
Well, if nobody else has a question right now, I have a sort of, it's a tangential question. So you brought up a couple nice examples of how philosophy teachers are sometimes themselves not as sensitive to the context of their examples as they should.
Yeah.
Right? They're telling the truth to their students. The ontological argument doesn't convince anybody.
Yeah.
Kant really did say that about animals. And I like the ontological argument example because, well, I try to do what you did.
Yeah.
I don't make that mistake. And the textbooks I use always do, but I try to contextualize and say, look, it's a prayer. It's a meditation on it. But the Kant part, I think I do just what you said.
Yeah.
And I'd like you to say more about why I'm wrong. Because
Okay, right.
I'm pretty sure Kant has a horrible view
Yeah.
about animals. And
Yeah.
I'm pretty sure that people prior to Kant did not all have a worse view.
Yeah.
Right? And that seemed to be what you were implying, that Kant could be justified there in his indirect, instrumental argument.
Yeah.
I mean, after all, this argument gets it's not an isolated move in Kant. It's tied into his fetishization of rationality above all.
Yeah.
And that fetishization affects not just animals, but human beings
Yeah.
who don't meet the bar.
Yeah.
So this is a bit of a side
Yeah.
issue, but I'm just curious. I mean, I'd like to teach Kant more charitably.
Yeah.
I think I'd like to teach Kant more charitably.
You'd like to teach Kant, you know.
I do like to teach Kant.
I guess the story before Kant runs something like this. You have that preponderance of ideas that comes out of the Cartesian tradition and a certain uptake on what Descartes says. Now, I'm not going to get into, we're already in the Kant argument, I'm not going to get into the Descartes argument about what he really means in relation to animals, but certainly he was seized upon by a lot of Cartesians who basically regarded animals as biological automata. So, they've got pain behavior. Look, as I stab it, it'll illustrate some pain behavior. Yeah, but it's the equivalent of what we would think, you stab a television today. Don't do that, they're electronic and stabbing things tend to be metal. It's not a good idea. And the television set goes, ouch, or something of that sort, or the monitor goes, ouch. We dismiss it, we think it's not real suffering. But it was a convenient doctrine to hold during the emergence of the